back to Calaveras Presbyterian Church evening service. Glad you're here. I should tell you that my secret ambition in life has always been to play the timpani, and there they sit right there. I really would like to go down there and beat the drums. Instead, we'll continue with our reading of the Psalter. Turn to page 810 in your hymnal. Page 810, we're going to read the first 19 verses of Psalm 72. Psalm 72, 1 through 19 on page 810. Let's read this responsively. Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. He will judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. The mountains will bring prosperity to the people, the hills, the fruit of righteousness. He will defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. He will crush the oppressor. He will endure as long as the sun, as long as the moon, through all generations. He will be like rain falling on a mown field, like showers watering the earth. In his days the righteous will flourish. Prosperity will abound till the moon is no more. He will rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. The desert tribes will bow before him, and his enemies will lick the dust. The kings of Tarshish and of distant shores will bring tribute to him. The kings of Sheba and Seba will present him gifts. All kings will bow down to him, and all nations will serve him. For he will deliver the needy who cried out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy, and save the needy from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. Long live he, may gold from Sheba be given him. May people ever pray for him and bless him all day long. Let grain abound throughout the land. On the tops of the hills may it sway. Let its fruit flourish like Lebanon. Let it thrive like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever. May it continue as long as the sun. All nations will be blessed through him. They will call him blessed. Praise be to the Lord God, the God of Israel, who alone does marvelous deeds. Praise be to his glorious name forever. May the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen. Turn to hymn number 441. This is Isaac Watts' versification of this, based on this psalm. Jesus shall reign wherever the sun does his successive journeys runs. His kingdom stretch from shore to shore, till moons shall wax and wane no more. 441. Conclude our series on defending the faith this evening. There are quite a number of other episodes in this series, but we thought we'd move on to something else in weeks to come. Tonight's this series has been admittedly a bit philosophical and academic, esoteric, if you will. I think these two episodes tonight are a little more on the practical side, news that you can use as you begin to try to defend your faith where you ever may encounter the need to do so. The first episode is called Vanity of Vanity, a phrase, of course, used in the book of Ecclesiastes. And the second episode is called the Philosophy of Atheism.
As we continue now with our study of defending our faith, the science of apologetics, you will recall that in our last session, I looked briefly at the moral argument for the existence of God that was set forth by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And I mentioned that he approached this question from a practical consideration, coming to the conclusion that we must live as if there were a God. Kant, from a rational, scientific, theoretical perspective, was agnostic, saying through our normal avenues of research and investigation, we can't know that there is a God. Yet, for practical purposes, we must assume that there is a God in order for life to be meaningful, for society to be possible, and we looked at how he constructed that practical argument from his awareness of this categorical imperative, this moral imperative that is shared by people around the world. Now, at the end of that lecture, I mentioned that not everybody in the philosophical realm agreed with Kant's conclusion that we must live as if there is a God. Some were what they might be called as hardcore cynics or skeptics, and they said just because the options to the existence of God are grim, that is no reason to believe in God. That would be like falling into an Alice in Wonderland scenario where you take a deep breath and close your eyes and wish with all of your might that life is meaningful, life is significant, that somebody's home up there who's going to make justice take place in the final analysis, and have that as a ground for faith. Well, let me say this before we continue, that in the history of philosophy and of theoretical thought, I think that we could certainly isolate and individuate at least 1,000 different distinctive philosophies, philosophical theories, philosophical movements, and so on. But there is a gamut that these philosophical systems run. They tend to find themselves somewhere between two poles or two polar extremes. On this side, we have what I call full-bodied theism. And on this side of this pole would be nihilism. And nihilism is not only that there is no God, but it also goes from that conclusion to the idea that there is no meaning, no significance, no sense to human existence. And all other philosophies find themselves situated somewhere along this continuum, in between these two poles. Now, if you look at historic Christianity, and Judaism for that matter, if you go to the Old Testament scriptures, you see that the wisdom literature of the Old Testament wrestled with these two antithetical positions, chiefly in the book of Ecclesiastes, where two different perspectives are explored. There is life as it is experienced under the sun, and life as it is experienced under heaven. Now, if I could translate that, and indeed transfer it into modern categories, you go back to Kant and Kant's criticism of the distinction between his noumenal world, the realm of God, and the phenomenal world, the realm where we observe things in the scientific exploration of our senses. And he saw this wall that existed between this world and the transcendent world. Now, if we took Kant's theory and then moved it backwards into the Old Testament, you could say that the distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world would be the distinction between life under heaven, which is the noumenal realm, or life under the sun, which is the phenomenal realm. And what was the crux of the conflict that the Qoheleth is speaking to in the book of Ecclesiastes is this, that life under the sun ends in the final analysis if there is no God, if it is not under heaven, but if life is restricted strictly to this side, under the sun, to the phenomenal realm, then the conclusion that the philosopher of that day came to was found in the phrase, vanity of vanity, all is vanity. Now, the expression vanity of vanity is an expression of the superlative. Take it over into the New Testament. When Christ is exalted by the New Testament scriptures and he is seen as the King, he is called what? The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. That's a Hebraic way to say the supreme King, the supreme Lord, because he's King of the King, Lord of the Lords. And that's the same thought that's in this idea of vanity. Vanity of vanities. It's an extreme position to conclude that everything is vanity. Now, what is meant by the term vanity here is not pride that is found in somebody we say is vain and narcissistic because they sit at the vanity in their makeup room and apply all of their makeup and cosmetics because they are so vain. That's not the significance or meaning of vanity here. Here the term vanity is a synonym for the word futility. So what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying, from the vantage point of the phenomenal, without reference to God, if there is no God, then, of course, in the final analysis, what we encounter is futility of futility. Everything that we do is futile. We are locked in a cycle, a vicious circle that has no beginning and no purpose, no teleology, no significant end. The sun rises, the sun sets, then as Hemingway described it, the sun also rises again, and it sets, and it's going nowhere. That's the basic underlying philosophy of nihilism. It's, that the poor player struts his ire on the stage and is heard no more. It's the tale, told by the idiot that is full of sound and fury that signifies thus neither, the nihil, nothing, nada, meaninglessness. Now, there are few philosophers who are willing to go to that extreme. Most philosophers in history who have rejected full-bodied theism have sought to develop a worldview or a philosophical system that exists somewhere between these two poles. And so, in a sense, anywhere you find yourself on this continuum, you are borrowing capital from one or the other. I've always said this about humanism, that in the final analysis, humanism, which is so popular, is extremely naive. Because the humanist tells us there is no God, and that our origins come from nothing, accidentally, from a meaningless event, and that our lives are moving inexorably towards annihilation. So that the two poles of human existence, these two poles are meaninglessness at our origin and meaninglessness at our destiny, and yet the humanist fights for human rights and human dignities in between these two poles, where I keep saying to the humanists, you have both feet planted in midair, and as Francis Schaeffer used to say, you're on a roller coaster without brakes, because you want to have meaning between the two poles of meaninglessness, and in the final analysis, you are resting on sentiment. You just don't have the courage to go where your atheism drives you, which is to full nihilism. And so that's just one example of how systems in between here will borrow capital. There's no basis for believing in human dignity if we're cosmic accidents. But humanists fight for human dignity, and so they try to sneak in that which they are borrowing from Christianity, from Judeo-Christianity, even though they categorically reject the source of human dignity. That's the point I'm saying. So that there are compromise positions between here. Now I'm trying to paint here with a broad brush and simplify this with a minimum of distortion. But this is what Kant saw in his moral argument. This is what Dostoevsky saw, where he said, if there is no one home here, then the Bible is right with this thesis. Remember these words that we find in the New Testament: without Christ, without hope. And when he wrote to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul said, if Christ is not raised, and if all those who have died have perished, then we are of all people the most to be pitied. And if you don't like that we are believers, don't be mad at us, don't be hostile towards us. Feel sorry for us. Just think of all the fun we're missing that you're having and enjoying, and we're walking around, naively naively looking at God and believing in God and trusting in God and all that, when Christ is a dead man. And if I'm devoting my life to a dead man, what a waste of my energy and of my life. And if you disagree with my convictions, don't be mad at me. Pity me is what Paul is saying, because we are pitiable. But the idea here is, really, if you have no basis for establishing confidence in the God of the universe, you have no foundation for hope whatsoever. That you must come to hopelessness. Well, Kant didn't want to go to hopelessness. Kant said the whole fiber of our humanity, every bone in our body screams to us from the time we're first awake in consciousness that our lives do count, that our lives have meaning, and that the labor that we are engaged in, the sweat, blood, and tears that pour out from our passion, that those passions have meaning. And if we thought that they didn't, we would want to end that labor and end our misery. Well, you see, that's where philosophy's gone. Albert Camus, 20th century existential philosopher, came to this conclusion, that the only serious question left for philosophers to explore is the question of suicide. And what Camus is saying simply is, if you awaken to the reality that there is no God, that there are no absolutes, then you understand that there's no ultimate meaning. You might like it for a season. It might sound good when you hear that school's out, no more teachers, sassy looks, and so on, because we have a vacation from the God of the Bible who says he's going to hold us accountable for everything that we do. And when we find out that that God doesn't exist, we leap into the air and click our heels together and say, I'm free. Thank God I'm free. I can do whatever I want. I can do my own thing. And that sounds terrific until you turn it over and look at the price tag. And that's what Camus said. If, for example, if you are not accountable ultimately, it's simple to understand that ultimately you don't count. Life doesn't count. And if you really think about that consistently, then you understand why Camus says the only serious question left is suicide. That's why Jean-Paul Sartre, in a tiny little book called Nausea, he titled the book Nausea because that was his final comment about the human condition, and he defined man as a useless passion. That's a loaded concept for Sartre because Sartre noticed that we as human beings are not automatons. We're not robots. We're not bumps on a log. We are living, breathing, thinking, choosing, caring human beings. That human life is marked by care. Human life is marked by passion. Now, what if all your passion, everything that you care about, is worthless? What if everything that you care about, everything that you love, is meaningless? Then your passions are futile. This is what Sartre said. That's what you are, a useless passion. All your cares come to nothing. See, that's what Nietzsche was driving at when he explored his concept of nihilism, following Kant in the 19th century. In other words, what the existential philosophers, the atheistic existential philosophers, the nihilists were saying was this: if we can't know that God exists, it's not enough to build our faith by crossing our fingers and hoping that somebody's home up there. If the evidence is to the contrary, if it's really true that life has emerged fortuitously out of the slime, then we have to have the moral courage, the intellectual courage to face the grim finality of the results and stare it in the face and say, okay, you're right. I came out of the slime. I'm going to the slime. I'm a grown-up germ sitting on one cog of one wheel of a vast cosmic machine that is running down and is destined to annihilation. That's where I am, and I'm going to face it. And I'm not going to run to religion as an escapist form. Realize the driving passion in contemporary culture is escapism. Escapism through hedonism. And the whole philosophy of hedonism is that you find meaning through pleasure. Maximize your pleasure, minimize your pain. It's the philosophy of Timothy Leary. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Let's put daisies down the barrels of rifles and let's just go on a trip. And go to La La Land, where I don't have to think anymore. It's an escapist form from pain, from having to consider what the popular music is telling us, what the film industry is telling us, what the high priests of science are telling us. You are a beast in human clothing with no ultimate significance. And this message is being beat into kids' ears over and over and over again. And so They drown it out with the sound of their music, or with the drugs, or with other forms of substance abuse, as a means of escape. Now, what Nietzsche and the skeptics would say is that's not the only drug. The supreme drug to escape nihilism, according to 19th century atheism, was the opium of religion. If you're a Christian, I'm convinced that you haven't been a Christian for 2 weeks until somebody has already said to you, the only reason you're a Christian is that you're using your faith as a crutch. And that crutch is something that you use is to help you function, to help you remain mobile when in fact you are crippled. That's what a crutch is for. And the charge is that we use religion as a psychological crutch because we can't bear the message that we're getting from all sides. So we turn to religion as the ultimate form of escape, the ultimate drug, the ultimate crutch. What Marx referred to as the opium of the masses, as a narcotic to dull our senses, to minimize pain. In other words, that religious people are just one brand of hedonists who seek their pleasure in escaping from the real world of futile passions, futile labor, of death. Now, again, in the 19th century, when we study the voices of the atheists of that period, they really weren't working that hard to disprove the existence of God. Rather, their opening assumption was there is no God. And the biggest problem that Marx and Feuerbach, Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and other titanic thinkers, skeptics of the 19th century, that the question they were trying to answer was this: since there is no God, why is it that human beings are incurably religious? Why is it that man could be defined not only as Homo sapiens, but we could more properly define mankind as Homo religiosus, man the religious person? Because wherever we go, throughout the world, we find the vast majority of people engaged in some kind of religious activity. And from a Christian point, that religion may be complete idolatry, but nevertheless, it is still religion. And so the most common and frequent answer that came from people like Marx and Feuerbach and Freud and so on was that the phenomenon that answers the universality of religion is psychological fear. That is, that the main reason why people believe in God is because they're afraid of the consequences if there is no God. The main reason we create God in our own image, said Feuerbach, is because we understand that without God, we are doomed. We are in a hopeless situation. We are indeed a useless passion, and we can't bear the grimness of nihilism. So to escape nihilism, we leapfrog over all of these intermediate options and affirm the existence of God as our bromide, as our narcotic, to dull our senses from the pain. So that the number one argument against theism in the 19th century was that theism is a result of the psychological need of naive people. Now in our next session, I'm going to examine that from a Christian perspective and see whether the shoe may be on the other foot or the crutch may in fact be for the other leg. In our last session, we explored how the 19th century atheists, in seeking to understand why mankind seems to be incurably religious, that they came up with multiple theories that would say that religion is a result of the inventive, creative imagination of human beings who simply don't have the moral courage to face the cold, stark reality of the ultimate meaninglessness of human life, so that there is a psychological impulse, a psychological need out of which, in order to escape grim reality, people formulate for themselves in their own comfort the idea of a God who hopefully will rescue them from meaninglessness. Now, when I mentioned at the beginning of this course how I used to teach a course in atheism where I required my students in the graduate school to read the primary sources of the atheists, and that as we analyzed them, I looked at the epistemological patterns that we've explored, questions of causality and rationality and so on. But also, if you recall those earlier lectures, I mentioned that almost to a man, the critics of theism came back to this principle that the real impetus for theism is grounded in human psychology. And because of that, several years ago, I undertook to write a book for lay people to give them a brief introduction to some of these skeptical philosophers, and to show how the New Testament responds to it. And the original title of this book, which is now in paperback, was called The Psychology of Atheism. The title now is If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists? In other words, I'm playing on the principle we talked about the last time, where the 19th century skeptics were saying, if there is no God, why are there theists? And their answer was psychological need. And so I'm asking in this book, if there is a God, why are there people who deny his existence, and so on. And early in the book, I have a discussion of why it is that great thinkers disagree. We've mentioned that in the past, that some of the most brilliant thinkers in all of history have come to both ends of the pole. Though I radically disagree with Jean-Paul Sartre in his understanding of reality, I certainly don't think that he's a dummy. Jean-Paul Sartre was one of the most insightful, engaging, acute thinkers of the modern era. And certainly John Stuart Mill was also a giant in terms of his intellectual power. He was prodigious, obviously, as was Kant and Hume and Feuerbach and the others, Nietzsche. And yet on the other side of the coin, you have people like Aquinas and Augustine and Anselm and the Titans historically who have defended the theistic arguments. And so it's not just a question of superior intellect, that the difference among people may be because the evidence was incomplete for one group or the other. Somebody made logical errors, and we know that brilliant people can disagree because of epistemological errors of one sort or another. But I said one of the factors that has to be included in this whole debate is the psychological factor. Let's agree right up front that the question of the existence of God is indeed loaded with psychological baggage. I was at a soccer game last night, and I was sitting next to a man who was getting more and more exercised by the referee's calls, because he felt that the referee was favoring the opposing team. And he asked me about it after the game, and I said, you know, I used to be a basketball referee when I was in seminary, and I can tell you this, that when I was refereeing basketball games with another guy, and if the place was filled to capacity, I knew that there were only two people in the whole room who didn't care who won the game. And it was me and the other ref. I said, because we didn't have a bias, we really didn't. But everybody else in that room had a bias. And they see plays through that. They anticipate, they think somebody's going to foul the person, and even if they don't touch them, in their eye, they see the foul and want to know why I didn't blow the whistle, or so on. And so we know that, and we all have experienced that as we root for our favorite teams in sports and the like. That we as people are capable of looking at the evidence through a lens that favors our own bias. And I have to say, before the whole world, that every bone in my body wants there to be a God. I can't stand the thought that my life is a useless passion. And so I have to admit that it, not only that I have that desire, but I also agree with the skeptics that it is possible for people to construct philosophical systems on the basis of their own desires, on the basis of their own prejudices and biases, and have that cloud their thinking. And I also want to say, in the final analysis, the reality of the existence of God cannot be determined on the basis of what I want to be true. And I agree with the critics of Kant that just because life would be meaningless without God, that's not sufficient grounds to argue for the existence of God. All that really describes is the state of our subjectivity and of our desires. It doesn't prove God one way or the other. But one of the things that I think we have to understand is that everybody who gets involved in the discussion of the existence of God is dealing with the same psychological baggage. Because for those who deny the existence of God, there is an enormous vested interest on their part for the denial of the existence of God. Because God stands as the greatest obstacle in the universe to my own autonomy. If I really want to do my own thing with impunity, then I know that the highest obstacle to that would be a self-existent eternal God who is righteous and who is just. And that if I have ever sinned and have not repented of my sin, I know the worst thing that could befall me would be to fall into the hands of the living God. And so denial is not just a river in Egypt. I will do anything in my power to deny my guilt and to deny my culpability, even to the point of denying that I am accountable ultimately for my existence. Now, again, let me say that if there's a psychology for God, that doesn't prove God. And if there is a psychology against God, that doesn't disprove God. In the final analysis, arguments for the existence of God have to be established on an objective basis, not on the basis of subjective preference. That's what I've been trying to indicate throughout this series. But I'm taking this parenthesis here to answer the charge that the only reason why people believe in God is out of psychological wish fulfillment or psychological projection. And to make it clear that there is as much psychological pressure or desire for the atheist to deny the existence of God as there is for the theist who wants to affirm the existence of God, so that we can clear the air on that. And the New Testament speaks directly to this issue. On frequent occasions, for example, the New Testament says that fallen man in his sinfulness, will not have God in his thinking. That our natural moral condition is to have a reprobate mind. A mind that has been darkened, so darkened by prejudice, that we do not want to even open the window a crack to allow the rays of God's self-revelation into our head, because we know it's at stake. We know we're in trouble if we let that knowledge in there. Now, Paul develops this in some detail in his letter to the church at Rome. And in this book, I give an entire chapter of exposition of Romans 1, and I'm not going to go into all the details of it here, but simply give you an overview and remind you that at the very beginning of this course, we talked that in Romans 1, the Apostle Paul argued that the invisible things of God can be known through the created universe. And I remind you that I told you that there was a collision course between the skepticism and agnosticism of Immanuel Kant on the one hand, and the affirmations that the Christian Apostle Paul makes in his literature, where Paul is saying not only can we know God through nature, but in fact we do know God through nature. Now, what Paul is really saying here, and this can be inflammatory if you're not a theist, but at least listen. You can disagree with Paul if you want to. I don't think you can with impunity, but if you're not accountable to me. But the point is that what the apostle is saying is that in the final analysis, your problem with the existence of God is not intellectual. It's not because there's insufficient information. It's not because that God's manifestation of himself has been obscure. Your problem is not intellectual, it's moral. Your problem is not that you can't know God. Your problem is that you don't want God. That's what the charge is, at least, from the apostle. And this is where he lays it out in the first chapter of Romans, when he says in Romans 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." Now, let me comment quickly. That very first sentence creates an allergic reaction in many people. The last thing they want to believe in is, it's not just they don't want to believe in a God, but they certainly don't want to believe in a God of wrath. I mean, there are many theists, who affirm the existence of God, who deny the God that they affirm is capable of wrath. The word that Paul uses is a strong one. It's the word orge, from which we get the English word orgy, which includes a violent eruption of passion. What Paul is saying here is that not only is God angry, but he's furious. Now notice that the reason for his anger here that is being made manifest is not that God is angry with righteous people or angry with innocent people, but his wrath is revealed from heaven against what? Unrighteousness and ungodliness. But what we have here in the text is a grammatical construction called a hendiadys, where two different words are used to describe the same thing. What the apostle is saying is that there's one particular sin that has caused God's anger to boil over. And that particular sin could be described both as unrighteous and as ungodly. And what's the sin? He names the child. All ungodliness and righteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. It is an evil suppression or repression of truth that Paul is describing here. And that word there, suppression, is just one translation. The form of the verb here in the Greek comes from the root katakain. Now, you don't need the the Greek there, but the word katakain has been translated held down, stifled, hindered, repressed, suppressed. That is, that what God is angry about is that God has given humankind knowledge that is not vague or obscure. The word there is phaneros, that God has clearly, and in Latin is manifestum, has manifested himself so clearly to every human being. This is how radical Paul's affirmation is, that he's saying that every single person out there, every one of you, knows that God exists. Because God has shown himself to you through the things that have made, and that he has demonstrated himself to you clearly, manifestly. But that what we do with it, every one of us, by nature, is to hold it down, to so resist it, that we take that information, that knowledge, and we bury it. We suppress it or repress it. Now, if we want to talk in psychological categories, let's translate this phenomenon that Paul is describing here into modern psychological categories. What kind of knowledge, according to the psychologists and psychiatrists, do we as human beings characteristically repress or suppress? Happy thoughts? No. What we call the images or the memories of painful, traumatic experiences. That's why if you go to see your psychiatrist because you experienced an undefined angst or a nagging fear of some sorts, or you're upset about something and you don't know why, and so you ask the psychiatrist to explore. He may give you an ink block test. He may explore your dreams. He may use symbolic associations, and he'll ask you things, explore your relationship with your parents, and he'll say to you, "Now, how did you get along with your mother?" And you answer the psychiatrist and you say, "Mother, I had a wonderful relationship with my mother. My mother and I got along terrific. I thought my mother was the most wonderful person in the whole world. Why do you ask me about my mother?" So the psychiatrist is not only listening to the words, but he's paying close attention to the non-verbal message that you're giving. And he does it for this reason. He knows that if we bury a painful memory, that repression or suppression does not annihilate the memory, does not destroy the memory. It is buried, but it wants to come back out. In other words, the force of katakain means to push something or hold something down by applying pressure against a counter pressure. The best image that I can think of is if you had a giant spring, very thick coil on the spring, where you had to push it down with all of your might in order to compress it, knowing that if you release the pressure that you have on it, that spring is going to come back up. And so it is with traumatic experiences. We bury them, but they'll come out through dreams. They'll come back up through symbolic gestures. They'll come back up, here's the key, in a less threatening form than they entered the consciousness in the first place. Later on in this text, the Apostle Paul uses another Greek word, which is a form of the verb metalasso, which means to trade or to exchange, in which he says, men knowing God through God's self-disclosure, once they repress or bury this knowledge, exchange the truth of God for a lie and serve and worship the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. In fact, the Apostle Paul, friends, makes this activity of the human mind and of the human heart the primary, primordial, foundational act of evil committed by a fallen human being, which is idolatry. To change the truth, trade it in, and embrace the lie. And again, if we take that into contemporary categories, this is exactly what the psychiatrist understands we do. That we don't destroy the original image or the original idea or memory. We trade it. So that if I had a problem with my mother, that problem comes out not in my conscious discussion, but through some tic or some gesture where I can now deal with it in a safe way. The apostle is saying there is a psychology to atheism. Because he goes on to say what it is that we fear more than nature, more than meaninglessness, is that the greatest fear that any human being has by nature is to be held accountable by a God who is holy. Because in the presence of the holy, we are immediately exposed of being unholy. And so the God of Scripture is a God who is omniscient, who knows everything about us. He's a God who is omnipotent, who is all-powerful. He's a God who is altogether holy, and worst of all, He's immutable. There is no hope that He'll ever grow weak and lose His omnipotence. There is no hope that He'll ever have a senior moment and lose His knowledge of everything that I've ever done. He will never get Alzheimer's disease. There's no hope that He'll ever compromise His righteousness or His holiness, because He is immutably holy, immutably omnipotent, and immutably omniscient. And all of these things are revealed through nature, and we know it by nature. And because that is so terrifying, it is our basic disposition as fallen creatures to have a vested interest to flee, since Adam and Eve fled the garden and hid in the bushes because they were naked and they were ashamed. That's the biggest barrier we have to coming to a full understanding of God, that we too are naked and we know it.
Those are both excellent, I thought. Any comments on those? Yes. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Great point in the second lecture, landing a lot on that we are suppressing something, and what we're suppressing is exactly that. What we're suppressing is truth. Why is the suppression of truth such a cardinal evil? Yeah. Yes, that's it, exactly. That God is truth. And so when you are, all truth is his truth, and when you are suppressing truth, you're attempting to suppress aspects of God Yeah, excellent. Let's start with the two lectures then. The first lecture, Vanity of Vanities. What was the genesis of that title? What was he saying that phrase meant first of all? That phrase out of Ecclesiastes.
Utility of futility.
Yes. That's a superlative, right? Like holy, 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 or 666, or Lord of Lords, or whatever. It's just saying vanity of vanities. It is it's the place where you have to come. Remember, he had that timeline from theism to nihilism. It's the place you have to come if you don't start with God. If you don't start with God, if there is no God, if you are just a cosmic accident, or as he was mentioning, Jean-Paul Sartre says, you're a useless passion, right? If that's all you are, if you're just stardust and chemicals, then vanity of vanities. There is no meaning to the phenomenal world. And he started out by saying, Kant was trying to rescue that and saying, no, this world has to have meaning, so we have to have a moral God. And then the philosophers who followed him were just saying, no, that's just wishful thinking. What were they saying? What was the kind of the big point out of that first lecture? The argument that was from the time of Kant on that was put against Christianity. Number one argument was, you only believe in God because he's a crutch, right? You have a psychological need to believe in God. Because the world is meaningless and it is nothing, and you just want to make it. And so, that it's an escapism for Christians. Do unbelievers have an escapism as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we talked about them somewhat in church even this morning. A modernist escapism is what? What'd you say? I heard it, I thought.
Lorelai said it in a whisper.
Oh.
I don't think you heard that.
No, what'd you say? Maybe I have good ears. Did you say science?
She said, nothing matters.
Oh, well, for the modernist, their escape from nothing matters would be, though, that I can make something matter. I'll just make heaven on earth. My reason is so powerful. I can create such scientific breakthroughs. I can formulate this or that government. I can have a perfect social program that my church can put together. We're modernists. We will make meaningful things out of nothing. We'll be Nietzsche's Superman. We'll pull ourselves up from our bootstraps by pure reason and science and technology. That's their crutch is, well, I'm meaningless, but I'll just make meaning because I'm a God. And then we kind of saw this morning, God dropped that Dagon on its face. Everything they said they could do. We had World War after World War, and we had just the bloodiest century ever, and we all know what the 20th century was like. And then how about the postmodernists? What is their crutch? There's no God, they would still argue. You Christians are ridiculous for you got to have this guy in the sky as your crutch to make life meaningful. Here's what we'll do to make life meaningful.
Embrace meaninglessness.
Yeah, and we'll just be hedonists to the max in the midst of that meaninglessness, right? We will drink what we want and do whatever drugs we want and sleep with whoever we want, and we'll do whatever we want. We'll find some, again, it's still the same thing. One is I'll find my meaning in my mind, and one is I'll find my meaning pleasuring my body, but it is still just meaningless for both of them. Meanwhile, all being like Karl Marx, and saying Christianity is the, what did he say?
Opiate of the masses.
Opiate of the masses, right? Yep. Yeah. And so they were not going to look through any escapism through original religion at all, and just be full-blown nihilists who take a couple different pathways. Have you ever met anybody who is a real nihilist, who really believed that life was futile? Have you ever met somebody like that? Yeah?
My younger brother would describe himself as an optimistic nihilist.
Okay. More power to him. Yeah. What, did he explain what that is? I have trouble envisioning an optimistic nihilist, but.
Right, as he would describe it, just that he has his own personal ideas of what's hopeful and happy and
Okay.
wants to bring it out into the world to benefit others.
Okay, yeah, so he's a rationalist and kind of a modernist, and yeah, that's how I would describe one of my main violin professors as well. Yeah, Dr. Stern was like that as well. He's a very, very brilliant man, incredible at his craft, but a thoroughgoing through and through materialist. Yeah, 100%. But just believe that exactly like that. Everything is totally meaningless, but I'm just going to play this violin so stinking good that at least right now there will be meaning. I will make it right now. Yeah. Were any of you ever that at one time? Has anyone here in their pre-Christian past say, well, I was something of a nihilist? That existence is kind of meaningless? Yes?
Mainly a hedonist.
What'd you say?
Mainly a hedonist.
Okay. Is it? Do you think it's more common probably to be a hedonist or to be a just
Yeah, I think way.
certainly more fun?
Yeah.
For
Depends
you
on if you're
people
a
would say.
qualitative or a quantitative hedonist.
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Too much is too much. Yeah. Yeah. Have you had an experience with so Glenn, what's your experience? You said it was your younger brother. What is his how would you describe his happiness in the world, or
It definitely fluctuates very drastically.
okay?
Sometimes he'll be on cloud nine if he's able to do something worthwhile. A lot of this comes out when he's doing his EMT work.
Mm-hmm.
And so he'd see pain and suffering and gore, and he wasn't able to really rationalize it
Yeah.
in a way that brought any comfort. It was all just pointless pain until he was able to do something that benefited them that he felt was beneficial.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying to the kids this morning. If you are somebody who does not see God in every bush, then you'll be fine if you're looking at the beautiful things. You'll be fine for a while, a little bit. But then when the horrendous things come across your path and you're not used to seeing God in every bush, then suddenly the dark black void that you've been staring into is staring back into your soul, and your nihilism makes sense. You reap what you have sowed. Yeah.
Did you just quote Batman?
Maybe. I don't know. Did I?
It was really close.
I am Batman.
The only difference between you and me is I stared into the abyss and blinked. You blinked.
I was quoting Batman via Nietzsche then, I guess, probably. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Is nihilism something that is preached often by people, secular prophets, secular outlets? Is nihilism something that is preached?
It almost seems like nihilism, with that position, you almost have to care to form that opinion, where an unbelieving hedonist doesn't really think about it, he's just thinking about himself and he's just going through life.
Yeah.
But a nihilist, you kind of have to philosophically think through things and come to a position.
Yeah.
So that's too much work for an unbeliever.
Yeah.
It seems like a really, really odd philosophy to champion too, because you're going to dedicate a lot of effort into going and preaching the gospel of nihilism, which why would it matter what other people believe if it's all
Yeah.
meaningless,
Yeah.
right? Like that just it seems like every effort you put into proving it or teaching it is really contradicting the belief itself.
Yeah. Yeah, really, and the great allure and attraction of it was in that quote this morning that I had from Nietzsche, that really he's saying God is dead, and his reaction to that was, people like me who are philosophers and creative thinkers are now free. There's going to be a new dawn, right? You know, if there is no God, if there's nothing transcendent in that sense, then I'm free to create whatever I want. So it really is, you know, the twin cousin of the hedonist. I can do whatever I want, you know, is really the allure of it. There's nothing transcendent, which means I'm the top. Nobody can tell me what to do.
I was reading an article this week that says that the new idolatry is the creation of artificial intelligence as God.
Yes. No, we're going to straight up have worshiping of. I make a prediction right now online that we're going to straight up have worshiping of AI, humanoid type bots. I mean, there's some robots that now with skin that can do human facial expressions, and you start to load in AI, and you can ask them any question, like they're the Oracle at Delphi. Like, you know, people in essence are going to be coming to this beautiful, you know, priestess right here and asking her question or whatever. And if you don't think that the dark powers aren't going to suddenly stop being AI and it's going to be a demon starting to talk through something like that, that's going to happen. And it's going to happen pronto, like very soon.
Even if the supernatural doesn't enter into that, the fact is that it's been created by sinful
Yep.
means. And so by that nature, that'll be the case.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a great good for the world for
No.
the most part. There'll probably be some really useful stuff too.
Yeah.
You know, like diagnosis of diseases.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a marvelous tool.
Yeah, but as far as what man will use it for,
Yep.
probably be robots that never miss.
Yeah.
You know, when they try and shoot you, or
Yeah.
as Elon Musk put it, a swarm of drones with small explosive charges that just go and clear any building they want. You know, directed by some human.
Yep. Yeah. And so practically speaking, because these were more practical for apologetics, how do you approach a nihilist? What do you do with somebody who's a nihilist?
Why they haven't killed themselves.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Ask them, how do you possibly even get out of the bed in the morning? Right? Why haven't you killed yourself? Right? That's what Camus said, right? The only serious question left to man is how and when to commit suicide. Right? If there's nothing transcendent and you're not, I love that phrase, you're not accountable to anybody, then you don't count. If you're not accountable, by definition, you don't count. And how do you even get out of bed in the morning? Yeah. So again, point of that first one, the number one argument against theism, he said, was it was a psychological need of a naive people. And then he went into, somebody started to say something, I just cut you off? Okay. Then he went into the second one there, and he started by saying that it's not a debate about who is the smartest, right? There are brilliant people on both sides, but he said the difference is they're both approaching with a bias, right? A worldview. Sounds decidedly presuppositional to me, right there. Didn't want to interrupt his lecture and tell him so, but kind of sounded that way a little bit. Right, entering with a bias. That there's emotional baggage that comes on. You're beginning with a bias. And what ultimately is, he said up there that his desire, every fiber of his being, he wants God to exist. And he admits that freely. What is the unbeliever's bias? Why do they not want God to exist with every fiber of their emotional being? Okay, guilt is part of it. Good. If he exists, if they feel guilty, why? because if a creator God exists, then they're not autonomous. They're not a law unto themselves. We're not a law unto ourselves. Creator God exists, then he stands against our autonomy. And so that's when he was getting to that. They just suppress the clear truth of who God is, and that is a spectacular and infinite sin because it's against an infinite God. It is the truth of God that's being suppressed. That's why God's angry, right? He doesn't like being suppressed. And then what Paul, he would point out what Paul says in Romans 1:28, that your problem is not intellectual as a human. Your problem is moral. And what he said there were truths that we're specifically suppressing. What truths are we suppressing? The good memories? Right, yeah, so we're suppressing the bad memories. We're suppressing what bad memories are humans suppressing when they're denying God?
Guilt of sin.
Every bad thing they ever did. Every nasty thing they did to people they loved, every cheat they ever did, every lie, every dark thing that they know, they're suppressing. They're suppressing all of those. And they're suppressing those because their greatest fear, he said, is not a meaningless existence. They would rather accept the concept of a meaningless existence and I die and just turn to dust and vaporize and I'm nothing. They'd rather accept vanity of vanities than the one thing that's worse than that there's a holy God.
Holy and just God. Yeah.
Right. There's a holy God.
When Glenn said optimistic nihilist, I thought that would have meant, man, I hope I'm right because I don't want to stand before God.
Right. Right.
It's really just a hedonistic nihilist. I don't think you really have a functional nihilist unless they're hedonistic to some extent.
Yeah. 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 So his greater fear than meaninglessness is fear of a holy God, and of a holy God who never forgets. Right? That's the great. If he could forget, then right? But he never forgets, and he said up there, he was saying we stand naked before him. Right? There's nothing.
And one who you'll stand before knowing full well that he's totally just in exacting his wrath upon you.
Yes.
Right? That you'll be in full agreement with him to cast him out. Yeah, I deserve that. No, I didn't lack evidence. No, I didn't have a good excuse.
Yeah.
I deserve this.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
into the outer darkness with the gnashing of teeth and wailing.
Yeah, so it's very obvious why if you have a Christian message that you're delivering and it does not include wrath, then it's not actually a Christian message. It's at its core you have to communicate the wrath of God. You have to communicate that God is wrathful, that he has a right to be angry. And you have to communicate a fear of God. Now, should Christians fear God?
Yeah, he's a God that can throw you into hell.
Yeah, there's a certain sense in which we absolutely should fear him. It's the beginning of wisdom, right? Is there a certain sense in which we're forbidden to fear God? Yeah. What are we forbidden to fear about God?
You condemn us even though we've been declared innocent.
There you go. In other words, we're forbidden to fear. We're forbidden to have a doubt-based fear that he is unjust. Like, we should fear him because he's just, and we should also not fear him because he's just, if we're Christians. If we're unbelievers, we should be terrified because he's just. But we shouldn't have doubts about our eternal state, right? Because that really is making a statement to him. I'm afraid that maybe you are changeable. You are arbitrary. You are actually unjust, right? thankfully that's a sin that he covers as well, because we all have moments like that where we like have doubts and such. But just realize every time you are having doubt about God's salvation, what you're really expressing is that you think he might be unjust. Yeah, young man. What'd you say? We will in just a minute. Wait patiently. We're almost done. Almost got it finished out. But that's an important point to end on, right? That we are forbidden to fear that he is an unjust God. That he's arbitrary. Good. Any final thoughts or questions? Yes, JJ. Bring us home, baby. JJ, if the Lord spares me and I preach for 50 years, I'm going to call on you every single Sunday to hear that. That's so great. That never gets tiring, buddy. That never gets old. You keep thinking those things. I love it, buddy. Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that you are a just God, that you are a consistent God, that you are a holy God. You're not arbitrary, you're not unjust. And Lord, the great fear of unbelief is that you are just. The great joy and comfort of belief is that you are just and that you have put the penalty for our sin upon Jesus. We thank you for that. We lay ourselves in his mercy. We praise you that you have chosen us to be your children. And Lord, now as we have a few minutes to sing praises to you, we pray that you would be honored in this time of worship. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hymn number 644, I think, is a good one to end our study of apologetics, particularly the fifth verse. May his beauty rest upon me as I seek the lost to win, and may they forget the channel, seeing only him. 644, may the mind of Christ, my Savior, live in me from day to day. That's all for this evening.